The beginning of World War II. How it all started. A cataclysm that would consume continents, claim millions of lives, and redefine the very meaning of human conflict. But this was not an inevitable descent into chaos. It was the final, violent unraveling of a world pushed to the brink. This is not a story of a single battle, but of a cascade of decisions, miscalculations, and a failed peace. It is the story of how, over 6 years of tension, ambition, and broken promises, the fragile architecture of the post-Great War Order finally collapsed. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the political heart of a nation consumed by grievance, and on the fog-shrouded border of a resurrected state. The date was September 1, 1939. The location, the frontier of Poland. The units, the unleashed might of the German Wehrmacht, and the valiant, outgunned soldiers of the Polish army. What followed was not merely an invasion. It was the first, definitive act of the deadliest war in human history. To understand the powder keg that was Europe in 1939, we must first look to the aftermath of the last war. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 left Germany humiliated, crippled by reparations, and stripped of territory. In Italy, a sense of betrayal festered. To the east, the new Soviet Union viewed the capitalist West with profound suspicion, and from this fertile ground of resentment rose Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, promising restoration of national pride and a new Germanic empire, or Reich. Hitler methodically dismantled the Versailles restrictions. He remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. He orchestrated the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. In 1938, each act of aggression was met with appeasement by Britain and France. Desperate to avoid another continental war, the critical flashpoint was Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, Hitler threatened invasion. At the Munich Conference, Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Edouard Daladier, without Czechoslovak representation, handed the territory to Germany. Chamberlain infamously returned, proclaiming peace for our time. But for Hitler, Munich was a revelation. It confirmed his belief that the Western democracies were weak, paralyzed by their fear of conflict. Just 6 months later, in March 1939, he shattered the Munich Agreement entirely, sending troops to occupy the rump state of Bohemia and Moravia. Slovakia became a puppet state. For the first time, Hitler had seized non-Germanic lands. The illusion of appeasement was shattered. Along the Polish-German border, from the Baltic coast in the north to the Slovak frontier in the south, a terrifying force assembled in the final days of August. Over 1.5 million German soldiers of Army Group North and Army Group South moved into jump-off positions. They were supported by 2,750 tanks. The spearhead of a new doctrine, Blitz, or lightning war. The concept was simple and devastating. Use concentrated armor and motorized infantry, supported by overwhelming air power, to punch holes in enemy lines, bypass strongpoints, and drive deep into the rear, shattering command and cohesion. The legendary Panzer I-2 and the formidable new Panzer III and IV tanks rumbled forward under camouflage nets. Behind them, the artillerymen of the Heer prepared their deadly 10.5 cm Leipzig 18 howitzers. The Polish army, though courageous and numbering nearly 1 million men, was a force from a previous era. It relied heavily on horse cavalry. Its tanks were light and few in number. Crucially, its deployment plan, Planned West, was a fatal compromise, dictated by politics and geography. To defend the vital industrial regions and the capital, Warsaw, Polish forces were spread thinly along the entire lengthy border, with no major natural defensive barriers in the west. They were in a salient, vulnerable to encirclement from 3 sides. They hoped to fight a delaying action until the promised British and French offensive in the west could relieve the pressure a hope built on sand. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 31st, a carefully orchestrated piece of Nazi theater, Operation Himmler, provided the final casus belli. SS men in Polish uniforms staged a mock attack on the German radio station at Gliwice. They left behind the bodies of concentration camp prisoners, dressed as casualties, as proof of Polish aggression. It was a transparent lie, but it was all Hitler needed. At 4:45 hours on September 1st, the German pre-dreadnought battleship Schleswig-Holstein, on a courtesy visit to the free city of Danzig, opened fire with its 28 cm main batteries on the Polish garrison at West. The roar of its guns was the starting pistol. Simultaneously, all along the frontier, the sky filled with fire and steel. Massed German artillery, over 9,000 guns, began a synchronized, earth-shattering bombardment. Shells rained down on Polish border posts, communication hubs, and troop concentrations. Minutes later, the scream of engines filled the air as the Luftwaffe's Junkers Ru-87 Stuka dive bombers descended. Their sirens, the trumpets of Jericho, wailed, inducing primal terror as they plummeted near vertically to release their payloads with pinpoint accuracy. Their primary targets were not just frontline units, but railroads, bridges, and airfields, crippling Polish mobility from the outset. The Polish Air Force, though its pilots fought with exceptional bravery, was largely destroyed on the ground. By 0800 hours, the ground assault was in full motion. From Pomerania, General Heinz Guderian's the 19th Panzer Corps, part of Army Group North, thrust southeast toward the Polish corridor. Their objective, to link East Prussia with the Reich and cut off Polish forces in the north. To the south, the main blow fell. The elite German 10th Army, containing the bulk of the armored divisions, drove like a piston straight for Warsaw. The Polish frontier armies Poznań, Łódź, Krakow were immediately engaged in desperate, chaotic battles. Polish border guards, cavalry brigades, and infantry divisions fought tenaciously from fortified lines and in forests. But they were consistently outflanked, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Reports flooded Polish high command of armored columns appearing where they were not supposed to be. Moving at speeds previously thought impossible for an army, the human dimension of this onslaught was immediate and horrifying. For the Polish soldier, the experience was one of profound disorientation and shock. One moment, he was in a quiet forest outpost in the last moments of peace. The next, the world dissolved into noise, smoke, and flying metal. Communications broke down as shellfire severed telephone lines. Officers lost contact with their superiors and their subordinate units. The farmer-turned-infantryman, defending his homeland, saw metallic monsters he could barely comprehend, tanks crashing through the woods, their machine guns spraying deadly fire. Above, the ever-present Stukas seemed to pick targets at will. Villages and towns in the path of the advance were engulfed in flame. Roads became choked with a river of humanity. Terrified civilian refugees mingled with retreating soldiers, all under the merciless eye of the Luftwaffe, which strafed columns indiscriminately. By nightfall on September 1st, the German spearheads had penetrated up to 50 miles in some sectors. The Polish strategic plan was already in ruins. In London and Paris, the news was met with grim resignation. Ultimatums were delivered to Berlin: withdraw from Poland or face war. Hitler, believing the West would again back down, ignored them. Pause on September 3rd, at 11 a.m. British time. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, his voice thick with failure, announced over the radio that Britain was at war with Germany. France followed suit. Hours later, the European war was now a world war. But for Poland, these declarations were distant thunder. No meaningful military aid would come. They stood alone against the full, terrifying fury of the Nazi war machine. The second week of September saw the military situation for Poland transition from desperate to catastrophic. The Blitzkrieg was achieving its strategic goal, not just to defeat the Polish army, but to annihilate it through encirclement and disintegration. While Polish forces bravely counterattacked where they could, most famously in the Battle of the Buz. These were acts of magnificent desperation against an enemy that controlled the tempo, the skies, and the initiative. The noose tightened with brutal efficiency. From the north, Guderian's having sliced through the corridor, now turned southward, racing down the east bank of the Vistula River. From the south, the armored spearheads of Army Group South, having smashed through the frontier defenses, wheeled east and then north. Their pincer movement aimed to meet east of Warsaw, trapping the bulk of the Polish forces west of the Vistula in a gigantic kessel, or cauldron. Polish High Command, realizing the existential threat, issued orders on September 10th for a general retreat to the southeast, to form a defensive perimeter known as the Romanian Bridgehead, where they hoped to hold out until Allied aid arrived, a hope that was now a tragic fantasy. Pause. The true, devastating crisis became clear on September 17th. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the Polish ambassador in Moscow was summoned to the Kremlin. He was handed a note. It declared that the Polish state and its government had ceased to exist, and that, therefore, the Soviet-Polish non-aggression treaties were void, under the pretext of protecting the lives and property of Ukrainians and Belarusians in eastern Poland. The Red Army was crossing the border. In reality, Stalin was claiming his share of the spoils as outlined in the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For the Polish soldier and commander, this was the ultimate soul-crushing betrayal. They were now fighting a two-front war against two totalitarian giants, with no hope of reinforcement or supply. The order to form the Romanian bridgehead was now impossible to execute. Soviet tank brigades and cavalry divisions poured over the frontier, meeting little organized resistance from the scant border troops. They advanced swiftly to meet their German allies. The most famous meeting occurred at Brest-Litovsk on September 22nd, where Wehrmacht and Red Army officers held a joint victory parade. The image of German and Soviet soldiers shaking hands over the ruins of Poland symbolized the Synicum pillages that had birthed this war. In Warsaw, the crisis took the form of a medieval siege under modern bombardment. By September 15th, the capital was surrounded. What followed was an act of heroic defiance and unspeakable suffering. Under the leadership of Mayor Stefan and military commander General Valerian Chuma, Warsaw prepared for a last stand. The city became a fortress. Barricades of tramcars and paving stones were erected. But the German response was merciless. The Luftwaffe began a systematic campaign of terror bombing, targeting power plants, waterworks, hospitals, and residential districts indiscriminately. Day after day, the Stukas screamed down, followed by waves of Heinkel He-111 and Dornier Do-17 bombers. Fires raged unchecked. Food, water, and medicine dwindled. The streets were filled with rubble, and the dead, the civilians and soldiers trapped inside. It was a descent into hell. The deafening roar of artillery barrages was punctuated by the crump of falling bombs and the rattle of small arms fire in the suburbs. The air grew thick with smoke and the stench of cordite and decay. Hospitals overflowing with wounded, operated by candlelight, surgeons working tirelessly as shells shook the buildings. Children starved. The Polish army units within the city, though low on ammunition and exhausted, fought for every street, every building. But with the Soviets invading from the east, the strategic purpose of the defense had evaporated. It was now a fight for honor alone, against impossible odds and a foe who showed no quarter. In the narrative of the Polish campaign, there is no single, dramatic military turning point. The technological and strategic disparity was too great. The diplomatic betrayal to complete the true turning point was not a victory on the battlefield, but a decision of the human spirit. It was the conscious choice, made by the Polish government, military, and people, to never surrender legally, and to continue the fight from exile. This decision would ensure that Poland, though conquered on the map, remained a belligerent ally. Its contribution to the ultimate Allied victory profound and undeniable. As the Weiss closed in mid-September, key elements of the Polish state were evacuated. Precious gold reserves were smuggled out through Romania. The most modern destroyers of the Polish Navy had, under Operation Peking, sailed for Britain just before the war began. Now, the government and surviving military commanders followed similar routes. On the night of September 17th to 18th, President Ignacy Mścicki and Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Ryd-Smigwy crossed into neutral Romania, where they were interned, but the constitutional chain of succession was preserved. Before his internment, Mścicki designated Władysław Roczkiewicz as his successor. Roczkiewicz in Paris appointed General Władysław Sikorski, a respected opponent of the regime, as Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief of Polish Armed Forces in exile. This government in exile, quickly recognized by Britain and France, became the legal and political embodiment of continuing Polish resistance, but it needed a military force. And here, the second part of the turning point emerged, the incredible global journey of the Polish soldier. Tens of thousands of troops and airmen, following orders to avoid, capture, and continue the fight, made perilous escapes. They crossed on foot into Hungary and Romania. They traveled by ship from the Baltic states. They embarked on epic journeys through Yugoslavia and Italy to France. They were young men, often separated from their units and families, driven by a single-minded determination to get to an allied country and fight back. Their journey was just beginning. After the fall of France in June 1940, Polish soldiers again evacuated, this time to Britain. It was here that the Polish contribution became legendary. Polish pilots, battle-hardened and seething with a desire for vengeance, would soon form more than 10% of RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. The 303rd Polish Fighter Squadron would become the highest-scoring Allied unit of the battle. On land, the 1st Polish Armored Division under General Stanisław Mokwik would later distinguish itself at Falaise and liberate parts of the Netherlands. At sea, Polish destroyers and submarines sailed with the Royal Navy, fighting in the Atlantic and beyond. In intelligence, Polish cryptologists who had first cracked the German Enigma cipher before the war delivered their secrets to the Allies, giving birth to the Ultra-Intelligence Program at Bletchley Park. The turning point, therefore, was not a reprieve from defeat in 19... It was the transformation of a military catastrophe into the seed of an unyielding, global resistance. The Polish state, in exile, never surrendered its sovereignty. Its soldiers, sailors, and airmen, scattered across the globe, swore new oaths. They would fight on, from the skies over London, the sands of North Africa, the hills of Italy, and the beaches of Normandy, until their homeland was free. This indomitable will was the answer to the Blitzkrieg refusal to accept the finality of conquest. The military resolution in Poland was swift and brutal. Warsaw, after withstanding over 2 weeks of relentless bombardment and suffering catastrophic civilian casualties, capitulated on September 28. The final organized Polish resistance ended. On October 6, with the surrender of the last major units at Kock, the campaign was over. The cost was staggering. Polish military losses are estimated at 66,000 killed, 133,700 wounded, and nearly 700,000 taken prisoner, about 400,000 by the Germans, 300,000 by the Soviets. German losses, though far lower, were not insignificant, approximately 16,000 killed, 32,000 wounded, and 3,500 missing. The Soviets suffered about 3,000 casualties in their short operation, but the human tragedy had only begun. On October 8, Hitler formally annexed Western Poland into the Reich. The remainder, known as the Generalgouvernement, became a Nazi slave colony, a laboratory for racial ideology and terror. The SS and German police immediately began a campaign of systematic annihilation targeting Poland's intelligentsia, nobility, and Jewish population. The Soviets were no less brutal in their zone. In April 1940, the NKVD murdered approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, policemen, and intellectuals in the Katyn Forest and other sites of crime the USSR would blame on the Nazis for half a century. Poland disappeared from the map, partitioned between two tyrannies. The historical significance of September 1939 is monumental. It proved the devastating effectiveness of combined arms blitzkrieg warfare, a lesson the world would learn repeatedly in the coming years. It revealed the fatal flaws of Allied interwar diplomacy and strategy. Most importantly, it established the fundamental character of the coming conflict. This would be a total war, a war of ideologies and annihilation, where civilians were not incidental casualties but primary targets. The brave but doomed defense of Poland was a clarion call to the free world, illustrating the true, ruthless nature of the Nazi regime. For their valor, Polish servicemen were decorated by their own government in exile and their Allied hosts. The Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest military decoration, was awarded to many units and individuals. But the greatest legacy of those dark September days was the Polish armed forces in the West. They fought with distinction in every major theater of the European war, earning 15 battle honors from the British. Their story is one of ultimate tragedy, yet unbroken spirit, a nation conquered in weeks, but whose soldiers fought for 6 long years to reclaim its freedom, only to be betrayed once more by the geopolitical realities of the post-war settlement at Yalta and Potsdam. The war that began on their soil would end with them under a new Soviet-dominated oppression. The thunder of guns on the Polish frontier in September 1939 was the opening chord of a global symphony of destruction. It was the moment the fragile peace of 1918 finally shattered, giving way to a storm that would rage for 2,174 days and claim an estimated 70 million lives. The courage of the Polish soldier, the betrayal by cynical powers, and the horrific new reality of industrialized, total war, all of it was forged in those first, brutal weeks. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War.